welcome to this virtual event to launch the 2021 Global Women, Peace and Security Index. And it is appropriate that we are launching the event this week when the UN Security Council will be meeting for its annual open debate on Security Council Resolution 1325 on women, peace, and security. I'm Milan Verveer, and I direct the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace, and Security. And we're so pleased to be able to host today's event with two longtime and exceptional partners on the index, to whom we are very grateful: the Permanent Mission of Norway to the United Nations, and PRIO, the Peace Research Institute of Oslo's Center on Gender, Peace, and Security. I'm pleased to welcome more than 1,200 attendees joining us from around the world on Zoom and countless more on Facebook. Today, we are launching the third edition of our Global Women, Peace, and Security Index. It constitutes the most comprehensive ranking to date on the well-being of women globally. It goes beyond the dimension of inclusion, which includes education and participation in politics and the economy, because it adds the dimensions of justice and security. It ranks 170 countries. It's the first index of its kind to be developed within the framework of the Sustainable Development Goals. Since the last edition of the index, we will learn how the COVID pandemic has taken a toll on women's well-being, as it has disproportionately impacted women and girls. The index will also show how the significant increases in forced displacement are affecting women. We hope that the key findings of the index will illuminate future actions on the part of leaders, policymakers, and advocates alike to improve the well-being of women. After all, the condition of women and the condition of nations goes hand in hand. Countries are more peaceful and prosperous when women are accorded full and equal rights and opportunities. To begin today's program, I am pleased to introduce Ambassador Mona Jewell, the permanent representative of Norway to the United Nations. She's a leader on Norway's considerable efforts to promote gender equality and the empowerment of women and girls. She has had a long career in Norway's Ministry of Foreign Affairs, serving as ambassador to the United Kingdom, the Director General for the Security Policy in the High North, and as ambassador to Israel, among many posts. And she's also served as president of the UN Economic and Social Council. Ambassador Jewell, welcome and thank you so much for joining us today.
A very good morning to you all, and thank you very much, Ambassador Verveer. I'm really very happy to be here today. It is great to be launching the WPS Index in a format that allows for so many viewers around the world to take part. Excellencies, colleagues, it is a well-established fact that inequality and instability goes hand in hand. The Global Index of Women, Peace and Security is therefore not only a measure of women's involvement in shaping society, rather it is first and foremost a measure of peace and security around the world. Too often, the issue of women's participation and rights are sidelined to be dealt with when the situation allows for it. But the WPS agenda is not an end result. It is a stepping stone to reach stability and peace. Progress on this agenda is not only about progress for women, it is about progress for society, for stability, for security, and peace for all. However, As the index once again shows, we still have a long way to go. As you will see, the index provides analysis across the broad range of indicators, including women's inclusion, justice, and security, illustrating yearly changes within countries together with comparative, regional, and global trends. This is of particular interest to Norway, as a key priority for us is to advance the broad implementation of WPS, particularly through supporting efforts at country level. And in the Security Council, we endeavor to mainstream WPS throughout the work of the Council. To do this, we rely on internal as well as external information from our embassies, research institutes, our partners on the ground, and resources like the index to provide context and analysis. The WPS Index illustrates the many diverse challenges experienced by women around the world. It also shows how inclusion, justice, and security are interlinked, underlying why intersectional approaches are so important to deliver to our WPS commitments. For example, the index includes new detailed information this year on the status for forcibly displaced women as an additional dimension in Ethiopia, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan. The index also underlines how there is always room for improvement. While the Nordic countries feature at the top of the index, we are not perfect. In every society, there are those experiencing unequal treatment and exclusion. It is imperative that we recognize this. It helps us to look for ways to address gaps, especially structural ones, to achieving gender equality. And never has this information been more important as we all strive to build back better after the pandemic. The WPS Index is therefore very timely and relevant, and we hope that you, like we have, find value in it to take forward your work and policy building. I thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ambassador Jewell. Thank you for setting the stage for our discussion today, for your ongoing leadership on these issues, and for reminding us again about the correlation between equality and the lack of stability. They go hand in hand, as you so well said. We're going to turn now to the presentation of the 2021 WPS Index by Dr. Jenny Klugman, the Managing Director of our Institute and a widely recognized authority on gender equality, poverty, and human development. Jenny is not only the author of the report, but she was also its creator. Jenny, we're very eager to hear the key findings, so take it away.
Thank you, Milan, for the kind introduction, and to all of you for joining today. I'm happy to share highlights from the update of our global index that we launched at the UN 4 years ago, together with PRIO, with hearty thanks to the team that worked so hard to research and produce this year's report. Let me briefly begin by showing what is in the index. We have 3 broad dimensions: inclusion, justice, and security, and 11 indicators measuring these dimensions, as shown here. The indicators are equally weighted within each dimension, and they're combined to generate an index score which ranges between 0 and 1, where higher is better. We use publicly available data, like from the World Bank, from UN Women, and the Gallup World Poll, although this year, of course, we face constraints due to the pandemic. And as Ambassador Vivi already mentioned, all of our indicators can be traced to goals and indicators that have been agreed by member states in the context of the Sustainable Development Goals. And this year, we've added 4 countries to cover a total of 170 countries around the world. And just at the outset, I want to flag the performance on this WPS index is also associated with other good outcomes. We have a spotlight in this year's report prepared by researchers working on atrocity prevention, which highlights the very high correlation of our index scores with performance on other leading global indices, which capture outcomes that we care about, like human development in the Human Development Index, good governance, as well as environmental performance. And as you can see here on the left, a very high correlation with the capacity to deal with threats like climate change. So turning then to the key findings in this year's report. The first of our 3 chapters presents global, regional, and comparative findings. And I want to cut to the chase and give you the rankings for 2021. Norway again leads the world in the 3rd edition of this year's index. And you can see here the top dozen countries on the left side. You can also see on the right in red that Afghanistan has fallen to last place out of 170 countries. And indeed, the country's absolute score is almost 30% lower than in 2017, driven by worsening rates of violence and worsening community safety. Sad news as well is that all of the bottom dozen, except Pakistan, are also classified by the World Bank as fragile states, and 7 of the countries in the bottom dozen have been thus ranked since 2017. Turning now to regional patterns in performance, shown here, there are also major differences among countries within each region. A new finding this year is that South Asia has dropped to the bottom across regions, worse than even the fragile states group average. In South Asia, for example, fewer than 1 in 4 women are in paid work, and 1 in 3 men believe it's unacceptable for women to work outside the home. And no country in South Asia scores above the global average, as you can see here by the horizontal line, in Nepal falling below that level. Broadly speaking, there's a relationship with levels of per capita income. Money does matter. Richer countries do tend to do better, echoing what the UNDP's Human Development Report has underlined for many years, but it's not the whole story. There are a number of countries, developing countries, that do much better on the WPS index than in terms of per capita income, including Rwanda, Tanzania, and Jamaica, scoring at least 60 ranks higher. On the other hand, there are many countries that do much worse, particularly here, Kuwait, which scores some 104 places lower on the WPS index than on per capita income. We have an interesting focus this year on trends over time, going back to our first report in 2017. There is good news. Women's status has been improving, and the global score has increased by about 9% since our first edition. And around 90 countries have advanced by at least 5% over that same period. What's driven those improvements? It depends on the country, but I'd highlight the expansion of cell phone use, which has risen in 115 countries. Women's perception of community safety has also generally improved. But at the same time, the global rate of progress has slowed in the more recent period, significantly slowed, more than halved since the earlier period, and the gaps between countries have significantly widened. In 2021, Norway scores more than 3 times better than Afghanistan, compared to a 2-fold difference between the top and bottom ranked countries in 2017. And this pattern seems to mirror the global trends in wealth and income inequality that are also a major concern. This year's report, working together with PRIO, has a focus on organised violence. And as shown in the graph here, while the global number of battle deaths is below the 2014 peak, the number of conflict events has been rising. And a lot of this is due to non-state violence, particularly drug and cartel violence. And we highlight that as of 2020, about 1 billion people around the world live within 50 kilometres of a conflict event. And we know that this poses major risks to the protection, health, and safety, especially of women and children. Turning now to the second chapter, which looks at the impacts of the COVID pandemic, which has both exposed and triggered multiple crises for women. We don't have comprehensive sex disaggregated data covering all of the impacts, but we can look at how two key dimensions of the WPS Index, inclusion and security, have been hard hit. Women's employment has declined in over 100 countries since our 2017 report, falling by at least 20% in 20 countries. And you can see here the declines across the board. We investigate how occupational segregation along gendered lines has jeopardized women's work, how care burdens were exacerbated for women at the expense of their employment opportunities, and how informal women workers have faced even larger barriers. I think you all know that women have faced heightened risks of violence in the home during the pandemic. This can be traced to economic stress, to reduced access to services, and their inability to escape abusive partners. Large-scale survey data on intimate partner violence is not available during the pandemic for good reasons related to privacy and ethical concerns that WHO and UN Women have recommended. Nonetheless, we do have significant and accumulating data and reports confirming a rising prevalence of risk, including in Iran and Kenya, for example, as shown here. But there is some good news. And here I'm drawing on the very good work of the UNDP and UN Women tracking responses, policy responses to the pandemic. And of the 1,300 policy responses that have been tracked, over 3,000 policy responses, around 1,300 have been classified as gender sensitive. And as shown in the pie charts here, many of these have addressed violence against women, followed by efforts to address women's economic insecurity and unpaid care. I hope that you can explore these infographics after the event, and you'll see the spread across countries with major innovations in a number of developing countries, including Togo, Argentina, Bangladesh and Colombia, and the ways in which there have been significant efforts to protect women and avoid reversals during the pandemic. And we do know as well that women's groups have played a critical role on the front lines, even though they've often been excluded from leadership and decision-making roles. Indeed, only about a quarter of COVID task forces are women. In the report, we outline key ways forward and the importance of building back better, as the ambassador has already alluded to. We highlight the need for diversified outreach strategies to protect women against violence. We call for responses that consider intersectional aspects, such as minority and displacement, to ensure that no one is left behind. And of course, we underline the importance of comprehensive sex disaggregated data to understand the profile of need and the effectiveness of responses. The third and final chapter of our report looks at women's inclusion, justice and security behind national borders through our novel Forcibly Displaced Index and our new subnational analysis. This year's report includes the first effort, of which we're aware, to comprehensively capture the status of forcibly displaced women compared to host women and to men. As I think many of you know, displacement is at unprecedented levels, over 180 million globally, and compounds other forms of gender inequality. We developed and applied our new index to Ethiopia, Nigeria, Somalia, South Sudan, and Sudan, using the World Bank's high-frequency surveys. The slide here shows the indicators used, which is similar to the global index. We add measures of legal identification and mobility, as well as a measure of legal discrimination, which is designed to capture the disadvantages faced by the displaced. This new lens quantifies the extent to which forcibly displaced women do worse than host country women, as summarized in this graph. So you can see from the red dots, the index scores of host country women, and the grey bars representing the status of displaced women. So on average, the gap is around 24% against displaced women, and South Sudan, which has very extensive displacement, of course, also has the widest gap of some 42%. So displaced women are doing systematically worse than host women on a range of fronts, but especially we find on financial inclusion and the risk of intimate partner violence. We also measured gender gaps between displaced men and women and between displaced women and host community men. So the largest gaps between displaced women and displaced men emerge for employment. And you can see that in the graph here for the dark red bars, where you can see enormous gaps peaking at 150% in Nigeria. Gaps in other indicators are also striking. In South Sudan, for example, displaced men are twice as likely to have legal identification than displaced women, as shown by the yellow bar. What we present in the report, but I won't show now for lack of time, are the even wider gaps between displaced women and host country men, especially in employment as well as in financial inclusion. And that builds on earlier work that we did with the International Rescue Committee. And these gender gaps are important because they illustrate how gender inequality compounds the impacts of forced displacement. Finally, this year, we look at behind national averages, building on the analysis we did in 2019 for China, India, and Nigeria, again, revealing significant diversity. We go behind borders in 3 very different countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and the United States. And in each of those cases, reveal major disparities, underscoring the importance of going behind national averages and understanding how displacement, location, race, ethnicity, and class all affect the status of women. For Afghanistan and Pakistan, we construct a measure applied at the provincial level with 3 dimensions. It's similar to the global index, although with specific indicators capturing exposure to mass media and household decision-making power. In Afghanistan, the ongoing conflict had eroded the status of women. And of course, there are much larger concerns now under the new Taliban regime that I'm sure we'll return to in the panel discussion. What this map and slide highlights are some of the key deficits that were already facing Afghan women around the country, and the widespread disadvantages in terms of access to employment, low access to schooling, and very low levels of decision-making power. And of course, you'll recall that the national performance overall is very low, but even behind that, we see much lower scores in major parts of the country. And rates of organized violence or battle deaths are peaking at levels which are 4 times the national average and some 200 times higher than the regional average for South Asia. Turning now to Pakistan, which also ranks close to the bottom on our global index, it's position 167, we see again vast disparities across the 4 administrative provinces. In Punjab, the score is similar to Brazil, but it falls as low as 0.2 in Balochistan. And we see that women do especially badly on inclusion and especially on paid employment. What we also show here on the right-hand side of this graph is the intertwined relationship between violence in the community and violence in the home, highlighting the major threats facing women in Pakistan. Finally, our index has also been applied to measure the best and worst of the 50 states of the United States of America. The disparities here are again very wide, with top-ranking Massachusetts scoring more than 4 times better than bottom-ranking Louisiana. And we document how major racial disparities affect the status of women, how gaps in legal protection mean that the state in which women live has significant implications for her protections in the workplace, her protections in the home against abusive partners, and her ability to take paid time off for caregiving. And we outline key reform priorities to close those gaps in the US. In sum, the WPS Index provides both a simple ranking and a comprehensive picture of achievements and gaps on several fronts, highlighting areas where greater attention and investments are needed. Since our inaugural 2017 index, our work is featured in National Geographic magazine, on National Public Radio, Forbes magazine, and much more. Our aim is very much to inform and inspire and to provide a tool to hold governments to account for their commitments to the women, peace and security agenda, as well as to the Sustainable Development Goals. Our website, which I hope you'll explore after this session, offers not only the report, but access to the data used to construct the index. And for each country, you can see the national index score and ranking. You can compare with the scores of others and explore performance on component indicators. We do want to raise awareness about the index and its value to broad groups of stakeholders. It's been great to see the index cited by a number of governments in their national action plans and related statements, as well as by multilateral and regional organizations, from the UN to NATO and the OSCE. But of course, words need to be matched by actions. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Jenny, for that both detailed and cogent presentation, and most especially for your leadership and the work that went into being able to convey all of the data that you conveyed to us. And as you pointed out, there's so much more, and we hope that listeners and attendees today will go into the website to pull some of that out. We're going to turn now to our distinguished panel to give us their perspectives, and then we'll come back to Jenny during the Q&A portion of our program. So let's go now to Pavi Canisto, who is the chief of the Peace and Security Unit at UN Women. She's worked for more than 2 decades on issues related to development cooperation, to economics, management, and gender equality, both in Europe and in Africa. She was the senior economic advisor for Finland's Ministry of Foreign Affairs and the gender advisor, leading initiatives related to peace and security, climate change, and more. Pave, it is terrific to have you with us today. You obviously live your life in the realm of women, peace, and security, and we're interested in your perspective. Let me ask, what have you seen as major trends in gender equality over the last year? And what do you think we can learn from the index in terms of measuring and advancing progress for women and girls? Pavi?
Thank you so much, and pleasure to be here. And I'm very honored to be invited to the launch of this year's report. Congratulations to our dear partners, Georgetown Institute and PRIO, and pleasure always also to be with the Norway Permanent Mission in this event. So indeed, congratulations on the report and on the index, very interesting reading. And I would like to link this also to the Secretary General's report on women, peace and security to the Security Council, but it's just now out, publicly available. And last year, when we compiled information for that one, we highlighted COVID and how that is going to impact on women, peace and security. And as also the information now in this index shows, the predictions and forecasts have unfortunately turned out to be more or less right. So more people are food insecure, pushed into extreme poverty, and the number of displaced people continues to rise. So, and in many cases, women and girls have been the hardest hit. So we knew this, but we didn't do enough to avoid that one. And I think that is a worrying sign. And I would also say from a peace and security point of view, that is the worrying sign, because you knew and you didn't protect the people against the impact. So just highlighting that, to me, that is also certain kind of a early warning sign. Then the surge in violence, we have read about it a lot, and also the findings of the index highlight that one. But there have been very specific attacks against women who work for peace and security, women human rights defenders, and also serious limitations to women's civil society to operate in different circumstances. And sometimes COVID restrictions have just served as an excuse to limit the operating grounds. And of course, all this is linked also to that women are still not participating and considered as part of peace processes, not at parliaments. So in the conflict countries, women's representation in parliaments is just 19%, but elsewhere it's at least 23%. So women are excluded from peace processes. And then also in the report, you have highlighted an important element of unpaid care work and paid employment. That's really very much linked to women, peace and security and what can be achieved. So I think really that these issues need attention, and they also serve as a sign that we can influence them before. So maybe I'll leave it here at the moment. I don't know if it's for everybody, but I think Melan, your screen is frozen.
Have we lost Pave?
Is it me who is not? Can you hear me?
No, yeah, we're all set. I think, Milan, we're going to move to Daphne now.
We're going to turn now to Daphne Jayasinghe, who is the Director of Policy Europe for the International Rescue Committee. Her work includes policy advocacy to ensure better aid for refugees. She previously worked on women's rights policy for Action Aid, the UK, food and nutrition policy for Save the Children, and earlier for US Advocacy Director on women's human rights for Amnesty. Daphne, as you heard, this year's index puts a spotlight on the impact of displacement and COVID-19 on women and girls. How do the findings of forced displacement showing systematic disadvantage comport with the work that you are seeing in the field of IRC's work? And how do you see the index as being useful both to IRC and other institutions generally, and more generally for advocates? Jaya?
Thank you. Thank you so much, Ambassador Verveer, and thank you to Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security for another extremely valuable resource in the index, and to the Permanent Mission of Norway and PRIO for hosting this launch and including the International Rescue Committee. The IRC is on the front line of the humanitarian response in a number of the countries that are performing worst in the Women, Peace and Security Index, including Afghanistan, Yemen, the Democratic Republic of Congo, Syria, South Sudan, among others. We work in 40 countries worldwide, supporting people and empowering them across the arc of the crisis as part of the emergency response and with life-saving services, and then supporting them in resettlement and integration as they rebuild their lives. So the negative correlation highlighted in the index between women, peace and security and fragility is very consistent with our experience and very much on our mind, as we see, as Jenny alluded to, the rising number of conflict events, a deep concern as we know that the World Bank estimates that conflict drives 80% of all humanitarian need. with by 2030 an estimated 2/3 of the world's extreme poor living in countries affected by conflict. So the findings of the index on displaced women and the gaps between displaced women and host women were also extremely consistent with our own experience. Those higher risks experienced by displaced women of violence in the home, consistently less likely to be financially included or less free to move about, are trends that we find in our own work. And as Päivi just referred to, this has played out in very distinctive ways with regards to the pandemic and the experience of women in the pandemic and their chances of being included as part of the recovery. So, for example, as Jenny mentioned, displaced women who face barriers to the formal labour market, to formal financial services, will often rely on the informal labour market, or indeed on sectors that were hit hardest by the pandemic. So those employment gaps that we see in the index are likely to play out in different ways for displaced women who are already in marginalised sectors, already in the informal labour market without the protections of decent work, and already in those sectors such as retail, hospitality, or beauty services that were really suffered the effects of the pandemic and lockdowns. But I think it's really important that the index includes in its assessment of women, peace and security the elements of justice and the legal environment that enables, the enabling environment that permits displaced women access to the formal economy. And that plays out in different ways depending on the legal framework. And so it was great to see the index again using the Women, Business and the Law index to identify the legal framework, but also in the displacement index to use policies such as the Kampala Agreement to understand the regulatory barriers to inclusion for displaced populations. And this plays out in different ways in different contexts. So, for example, our upcoming research with the Overseas Development Institute on the impact of COVID for displaced and host populations finds, interestingly, that in Jordan, more men reported challenges to their businesses than women as a result of the pandemic. But this might be because the environment for home-based businesses, where women are often found to practice running food services, were able to continue during the lockdown and were able to continue their business. So that regulatory environment supported their resilience during the pandemic. I think it's of deep concern that the index has found an increase in the risk of violence during COVID, and that is also unfortunately consistent with our own experience at the IRC. We conducted a safety audit in 15 countries, and women emphasised how economic hardship heightened women and girls' exposure to risk of violence and exploitation both inside the home and outside the home. This was compounded by the closure of schools and limited access to remote learning opportunities for adolescent girls at risk, increasingly at risk of sexual exploitation, early marriage, early pregnancy and forced marriage. And so it's important to recognise that those ways in which forcibly displaced population were marginalised before the pandemic hit have been only compounded by the economic shock, by the vulnerabilities created by lockdown and the isolation that women have experienced. And the index has been extremely helpful in illustrating those risks. We're very grateful.
Well, thank you so much, Jaya. We're grateful for your work, IRC's work, but for your making these connections for us today with additional experiential information on displacement and the impacts of COVID. We're going to turn now to Miriam Safi, the founding director of the Organization for Policy Research and Development Studies, better known as DROPS. It is based in Afghanistan. She writes regularly for regional and international journals, is a member of Afghanistan's policy group, senior fellow at the Institute for National Security Studies, Sri Lanka, member of the Afghanistan Chamber of Congress, Chamber of Commerce for Women, and so much more. She's been engaged with the UN, with the EU, with NATO, with many think tanks and academic institutions from around the world. And we're really pleased that she's with us today, and especially at this very difficult time in Afghanistan. So welcome, Miriam. Afghanistan is perhaps the starkest case where the well-being of women and girls also reflects the state of Afghan society. This edition of the index includes, as we've heard, a special section on Afghanistan. And according to the index, Afghanistan's score dropped 30%, and it is ranked last of 170 countries. How does this data mesh with your own experience on women's lives in Afghanistan prior to the rule of the Taliban? And what do you worry about what will happen now under these even more difficult conditions? And because you are the researcher that you are, perhaps you could say a word on how to use gender disaggregated data to inform national and international policies. So with that, Miriam, we turn to you.
Thank you very much, Ambassador Verveer. And I'd like to thank the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security and the Norwegian mission to the UN for hosting this event. It's a great privilege to be here with you all. To answer the questions that you've posed, Ambassador Verveer, I'd like to give a little bit of a context to how much progress we had made, where were some of those difficulties and challenges, very broadly speaking, and where we'd be able to head from here onwards. In a 2011 poll by Thomson Reuters Foundation, Afghanistan emerged as the most dangerous country for women overall. And in 2018, a similar poll was conducted and found the country ranking second. Fast forward to 2021, the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security Index finds the country's score dropping by almost 30% in national average tallies looking at women's inclusion, justice, and security. Like you mentioned, ranking it last out of 172 countries. What makes the findings of this index more worrisome than ever before is that with the return of the Taliban, many expect for these indicators mentioned in the index to further deteriorate. These problems didn't just emerge. They are reflective of a deeply patriarchal society with long-standing issues of violence against women. In the first half of 2021, the UNIMA civilian casualties report showed that there was a little over 5,000 civilian casualties. And very, very shocking was a 40% increase compared to the same period last year. And what's shocking was that half of this was women, boys, and girls who made up these casualties. In the past 20 years, there were many commitments to women's rights. With this came great progress, but ultimately the superficial treatment of women's rights meant it remained vulnerable to external shocks. And where the notion of local ownership was promoted, it was narrow and focused only on male elite actors and served to actually reinforce the elite male-driven politics. As far as women, peace, and security is concerned, there existed only a hollow infrastructure. Therefore, this makes the indicators in the index very prevalent and relevant to what we are seeing and what we have been seeing in Afghanistan in the last few years. Afghanistan is the classic check-the-box case study for women, peace, and security. It signed off on the 1325 agenda by adopting a national action plan, had gender units in all ministries, and committed to a 30% women participation in civil service. Its police was working on an anti-harassment policy. Women were on the negotiation team, and it had its EVA law. What this shows you is that if you do not address the heart of the issue, the power dynamics, the patriarchal causes of gender inequality, and the normalization of gender-based violence, we will never be able to make progress in an index like the Georgetown. This was the past. But what we have now is an Islamic emirate that does not believe in human rights, and more specifically on women's rights, treating women as second-class citizens. Now more than ever before, we need real action, not superficial agendas or statements. Gender-inclusive analysis is the starting point for ensuring all of our policy recommendations and programming address the actual root causes of gender inequality. This is why I created DROPS in 2014. I observed that the nation was attempting to enter a period of becoming self-reliant, and it needed gender disaggregated data to enrich public discourse and influence policy. But what I found around me was research organizations and think tanks that treated women as objects of research instead of ensuring that they were the lens behind the research. This meant that policy analysis and recommendations being proposed to donors and policymakers lacked a gender lens. Without this gender disaggregated data, the lived experiences of women will go unnoticed in future policy planning. To play its part, in August of 2020, DROPS launched this initiative called Bishnow, which means listen in Dari, which uses tech-based research methods to collect women's views on key national issues at the subnational level. In July, Bishnow surveyed 3,480 women in 16 provinces, and the main findings were quite revealing and prevalent to the conditions women find themselves in now. 86% said they did not agree that the Taliban had changed their repressive pre-2001 positions on women's rights and freedoms in the districts that were controlled by the Taliban. 69% said conditions for women changed in districts that had fallen to the Taliban, including women being banned from working, from traveling alone, being forced to wear the burqa, forced marriages to Taliban fighters. 65% said that the quality of life for women in these areas were very poor, while another 22% said that it was poor. Lastly, when we asked what the status of education was for girls in districts that had fallen to the Taliban in the recent months, 53% said primary and high schools were closed in these areas. All of this is now happening in major city centers, including Kabul. This shows us that we need to listen to women on the ground because they know their communities. They told us what to expect. And my final remarks, we need to invest heavily in research, analysis, and data that can link to the women inside the country, as this is the only way we will know what is happening in their communities. There is no independent body at the moment monitoring the situation in the country. So we must urgently find creative and safe ways to ensure Afghan women's voices do not disappear. I'll end here for now. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Miriam. That was very, very powerful. And I hope all of us will do what we can to support Afghan women, particularly at this very difficult time. And so much wisdom and advice in what you conveyed. We're going to turn now to each of you in the same order in which we went, starting with Pave, then Daphne, and ending up with you, Miriam, with the same question to each of you for your recommendations of how best to take this work forward. How do we better improve the well-being of women, knowing what we know from our own work, but also from the extraordinary amount of data that's in the index. Pave, starting with you, please.
Thank you, Melan, and it has been wonderful to hear other panelists also speaking. So I wanted to highlight the 5 goals that Secretary General highlighted for Medicaid. Financing the women, peace and security, women's meaningful participation in peace processes, peacekeeping, also humanitarian response and other decision-making processes, economic security and post-conflict participation, and then women's human rights defenders, attention to women peace builders, their ability to work and their safety and security, and data and statistics, evidence behind this. And from this, I would like to highlight, well, one aspect, and maybe that's financing. I think, Miriam, you ended with saying investments, heavy investments in research and we call for that from UN Women's side as well, but heavy investment in anything in women, peace and security. So in this year's Secretary General's report, we are highlighting expanding military expenditure. So last year, the same time when the world economy contracted by 3.3%, world military expenditure rose by 2.6%. So same time when every country in the world was struggling with health systems collapsing, etc., they invested in military, not in healthcare, not in social economy. So what does that tell to people? That, so I'm just asking that one, and I think there is money, there are resources, they are just used in other means. And the lack of resources is also translating into inability to participate, to influence, to stand as candidates for parliamentary elections if you don't have resources. And of course, displacement is much harder if there are no resources for women and their families. And then Afghanistan case, I also saw that how difficult it is to get resources and channel funding to women's organizations, women working for peace and security already before the conflict or before when Taliban took over, but also during this time of evacuations and everything. It's been, I'm saying that if you're talking about needing to focus on women, peace and security, it's a priority. If you're not investing in it, if you're not resourcing that work, if you're not enabling women's human rights defenders and women's civil society, you're not doing it, you're just talking about it. So that would be my main message, invest in it. Thank you.
Thank you, Pave. And now to Daphne.
Thank you, Ambassador Verveer. So I think I would echo Jenny's words earlier on that the index is a really strong reminder that we need to match words with actions. It reminds us that an inclusive recovery relies on intersectional approaches that reach those who are already in danger of being left behind and continue to be at risk of violence and exploitation. And I think matching words with action takes political will, it takes visibility, and it takes, as Päivi said, resource. Political will in that those populations who are demonstrably excluded by the index, women and displaced populations, need to be intentionally included in recovery plans with more women as part of COVID task force, with more consideration for their needs in COVID recovery plans. Visibility means that we need to be able to measure and assess their needs, and that's where data is so important. So in as much as it's been really impressive to see those high frequency surveys used to build a better picture in the index this year, more data is needed. There are still gaps in the evidence and we can't assess needs without that fuller picture. And then just with regards to resource, needs are greater than ever. In spite of humanitarian needs rising in 2020, funding of humanitarian appeals still fell short. So now more than ever, we appreciate those needs of political will, visibility and resource as evidenced by the index.
Thank you so much, Daphne. All good points. And now to Miriam.
Thank you, Ambassador Verveer. In line with the recommendations proposed by the other expert panelists, I'd just like to add that when we're talking of the investment and within the development of a nation, especially if we're talking about investment in research, I would say that in addition to continuing to invest in research conducted by local organizations, we have to help them in finding creative solutions in reaching all segments of society. As mentioned earlier, there are gaps and there are communities that we are not able to reach. But there are solutions to be able to get to that. And I think bridging that and building those links and those lessons learned, I think now is more crucial than ever before. But in order to actually make this happen, the international community must be cognitive of the fledgling banking system in Afghanistan. The operational environment is not normal in the country. We have to be flexible with how we get and how we ensure funds get to Afghanistan and get to these institutions. Because if we don't, then the civil society community that continues to remain, the research organization that continue to remain, will disappear slowly. Second of all, Afghanistan is faced with a dire humanitarian crisis, which is bound to worsen as winter approaches. An INGO worker in Kabul, who we had spoken to in a panel recently, said, and I quote, "There was still a lot of uncertainties and the Taliban don't know much themselves. For instance, how many need assistance and who." Here, disaggregated data becomes incredibly important as it can tell us the scale and where the needs are. And within this, the role of women in the decision and delivery of humanitarian responses becomes essential. In a gender segregated society where you need women to access half of the population, human rights and humanitarian response are not a zero-sum game. They go hand in hand because the health of a nation is determined by the status of its women. And so those would be two recommendations that I would put forward for now. Thank you.
Recommendations well taken. So thank you to each of you. Before we go into the Q&A portion of the program, I want to turn for her perspective on all of this and her invaluable insights always to Dr. Tarun Trygestad, who is the Deputy Director and Senior Researcher at PRIO and the Director of the PRIO Center on Gender, Peace, and Security. Tarun is a leading scholar and expert on gender, conflict, and peace building, and one of our key partners in this report. She also served as acting director of the Department for International Politics, excuse me, at the Norwegian Institute of International Affairs, and as a researcher and coordinator of the UN program on peacekeeping and multinational operations. And she serves on many important advisory groups for the UN, NATO, and others. Tarun, it would not be an index launch without your participation.
Thank you so much, Milan, for your kind introduction. And ambassadors, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon to you all from the PRIO Center on Gender, Peace and Security in Oslo. PRIO's mission is to conduct research for a more peaceful world, and we take pride in producing innovative research of high quality. But just as importantly to us is it to put our research to work through direct engagement with policymakers and practitioners. And the Women, Peace and Security Index is a good example of putting our research to work. And we are really happy to contribute to the development of the index by providing statistical analysis and data on organized violence. And we are also proud to partner with the Georgetown Institute for Women, Peace and Security in this endeavor. And we have done so since back in 2016 when we started to develop the very first one. And I remember vividly our planning meeting, Milan, in Washington, DC. So this third edition of the Women, Peace and Security Index, this is the third edition of the Women, Peace and Security Index, meaning that we are now in a position to start observing trends over time. And as pointed out by Jenny and several others on the panel, we can clearly see that there is a correlation between being a peaceful and prosperous country and the level of women's full and equal rights and opportunities. And I think this is perhaps the most important insight of the Women, Peace and Security Index. In this third edition, we also see improvements in the scores in 90 countries, which is really good news. However, it is worrying, I must say, that the global rate of progress on women's well-being has slowed down. And as we have heard here today, that this downward trend has been accelerated by COVID-19. As Päivi also alluded to, there are good reasons to be worried about what the next edition of the index in 2 years' time from now will show us. I fear that it will probably be a continued downward trend. Another worrying trend, and one that we at PRIO have taken particularly note of, is that so many countries in the bottom of the index have been in that very bottom since the first index was launched in 2017. The majority of these countries are hard hit by organized violence and instability. The governments in question, as well as the international community, are simply failing to improve the situation for women in these countries. Not least are we failing when it comes to the inclusion of women in conflict resolution and peace-building efforts. Right now, Afghanistan is perhaps the most striking example of such failure, as pointed out by you, Malan and Miriam. On Thursday this week, the UN Security Council will debate the UN Secretary General's most recent progress report on women, peace and security. And in the report, he points to the importance of solid data to fill knowledge gaps and to support efforts at advancing the agenda. This index can contribute to fill such data gaps, and it is already doing so. Simple numbers do not tell the full story. There are both positive and negative nuances behind every figure. The country cases highlighted in the report are good illustrations of this. Still, the index provides a country ranking and comparison across regions that I believe is very useful for both governments, policymakers, and practitioners for further policy development and programming. I'm glad to hear from the panelists here today that the index actually serves such a purpose also for them. And I hope that the index will continue to be a source of inspiration for action. I would like to end my remarks now by thanking you, Malan Ferrer, and the whole team at the Georgetown Center for the great collaboration we've had on developing the index and always adding innovations with every new edition. A special thanks to Jenny Klugman. And I would also like to thank my PRIO colleagues led by project leader Siri Åsrusta for the vital statistical analysis and text contributions. Last but not least, I would like to thank the Permanent Mission of Norway to the UN for co-hosting this event, and the Norwegian Ministry of Foreign Affairs for generously funding the research that has gone into producing the index. The Norwegian government has proven to be a staunch supporter of the women, peace and security agenda nationally as well as internationally for many years now. And I'm glad to hear from the ambassador that the index is of use, of very good use, to the work that Norway is now doing on the Security Council. But I do hope that this index will also be useful to the Norwegian government and many other governments well beyond what is happening in the UN Security Council. Finally, thanks to each and everyone who is watching and listening and are posing very good and interesting questions in the chat. I don't know if you have been noticing that, Malan, but very good questions. So I'll stop here. Thank you all, and over to you, Malan.
Thank you so much, Tarun, always for your perspective and actually today for your call to action as well. We're going to turn now to my colleague, Ali Smith, for the questions as they've been submitted and coming in. And anyone who wants to answer, feel free. And Jenny, obviously, there will be many having to do with the index itself. So, Ali.
Sure. This first one is for you, Jenny, asking how you decide which indicators are most salient, and a specific question from Rachel Grimes, a NATO liaison officer, asking if the WPS Index will consider how women in each nation's armed forces are treated as an indicator, considering that by overlooking the role of women in a nation's military, we might miss out on a critical aspect of equality for women.
Thank you, Ali, and let me echo the thanks to all the expert panelists for the fabulous discussion today. Our choice of indicators was difficult, and as Tarun alluded to, we spent some time in 2016, 2017 both developing a conceptual framework that makes sense, but also practically trying to identify data sources which would enable us to measure the dimensions of interest. The overall framework that we developed around inclusion, justice and security, I think is robust. And the measures that we have there, as I mentioned earlier, are all directly related to the Sustainable Development Goals and Agenda, which has been signed off by 193 governments around the world. And so having indicators which have this very broad basis in consensus and that have been bought into and owned by member states, I think has been a very important criterion alongside the reliability of data. I think one important point to note, and we've been discussing this recently in other contexts and technical reviews, is that the indicators that we have don't necessarily capture, for example, the quality of women's work. We look at whether or not women are in paid employment, but not whether or not there's decent paying conditions. We look at the years of education, but not the quality of that education. We look at the laws which are on the books, but not necessarily whether those laws are being observed and enforced. And so you'll find in the report that we try and do deeper dives into those various areas. So looking at the nature of women's work and the constraints on women's work, we have an important spotlight that we developed this year, which is presented in Chapter 1, looking at the ways in which laws against violence have been implemented around the world. So it's very important to complement what we have in the report and indeed what we have in the index, which is necessarily simple, with much deeper investigations. And so likewise, to address the NATO question, I think it's very interesting to look at the performance on the WPS Index in terms of performance across the society in the status of women, with women in the armed forces. And I think that would be a topic that could be readily addressed in research and indeed is worth exploring. Thank you.
Thanks, Jenny. Ali, another question, please.
Sure. This question is asking, to what extent have you seen multilaterals and national governments take this annual assessment into account, and how can we ensure their greater attention and utilization of this research?
And anybody can join that question from their own situations. Jenny, you might want to respond initially in terms of what we've been seeing in terms of the utility of the index. With a new index, of course, it needs to kind of gain awareness as well as acceptance over time. But what we've seen is increasing number of citations in statements and in tracking. We've also seen a lot of interest at the regional level. So, for example, working with UN agencies in the Middle East and North Africa region, we worked to help develop with government officials their own versions, more nuanced versions of the WPS Index, better suited to local circumstances. So it's a combination of, I think, attention at a high level, but then working with local researchers, working with governments to see the ways in which it can be used indeed in their own work. Thanks. Have, do you have any sense at UN Women in terms of the index being utilized in the field as well as at headquarters?
Well, thank you, Melan, and thank you, Ali. So, yeah, what Jenny said, of course, this is, now the newest data is still so new, but I remember the last time, the previous version of the index, it really got a wide global attention, and it was cited everywhere. And of course, it is very helpful because it draws attention to women, peace and security in general. And while of course Jenny and Torun and you are much better placed to tell about the index specific outreach. I can say that countries and UN member states in general are more interested in advancing the implementation of women, peace and security, which is also the index shows that has happened. So now, for example, half of the UN member states have national action plans on women, peace and security. I believe actually the index can be very useful also for monitoring these national action plans.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you.
Torun?
Yes, exactly to that latter point. This is actually something we have experienced here at PRIO, that we have been contacted by countries, especially in the MENA region, but also in the Balkans, where they are in processes of either developing national action plans or maybe refining further existing national action plans, and that they want to see this in relation to the ranking on the index, which I find really interesting. Thank you.
Ali, I think we have time for at least one more.
Sure. And Miriam, did you want to comment on that last one?
I just wanted to mention and highlight that the findings of the index is the most recent data on the situation of Afghan women in Afghanistan right now. This is our starting point. Local research organizations, because of the security situation, a lot of such as the Asia Foundation report that had their national survey, their yearly national survey of the people, all of that has currently been shut down. And so while all of the local institutions have been shut down, we have this index to explore and look at deeper, because it gives us a baseline at this particular moment. So I just wanted to highlight that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. Good point.
Thanks, Miriam. So just a couple final questions here, mostly for you, Jenny, asking what were the most surprising findings of this version of the index compared to previous years? And then was there anything you were unable to address that you hoped to? And what are your plans for next year's index?
I think the most surprising from my point of view for the global index is the already slowing rate of advance, even without accounting for many of the adverse repercussions that we expect to see with COVID. So we've already seen the rate of advance halve in the most recent 2-year period. So that's a major concern. Because what we'll need to do, and I think as Torun and others have already highlighted, in the next report, we will be able, I expect, to capture the full ramifications of COVID. And all signs at the moment are that those are going to be very severe across the board. You know, when we can capture in the global index, the impacts on intimate partner violence, the impacts on girls' access to schooling, the impacts on women's paid employment and so on. So I think it was surprising that we already saw this significant slowing, but I think that with the next report, we really need to drill down and try and capture across the board what the repercussions have been. And then in terms of the future plans, I'm very excited by the disaggregated analysis. So I think extending the work on displacement, working with partners like the IRC and the World Bank, who have major commitments in this area, to have a better understanding of those differences. I think that the state level and provincial work also holds enormous promise, and working, I think a lot of that work needs to be done and should be done by local partners who are much more connected to the ground, as Miriam has indicated, and can also adapt the index to the particular settings to make it more relevant, and very importantly, hold governments and decision makers to account. So I think there's lots of unrealized potential. I think we've gone, some way in the past several years, but clearly there's much more to do. Thank you.
Well, thanks to each and every one of you, starting with Ambassador Jewell. And I want to introduce Andre Mundell, who is sitting in the Norwegian chair at the moment, and thank him because he is the special representative for women, peace and security in Norway. So Andre, thank you for all you did to bring us to this day as well. and to all of our participants, our extraordinary panel, Pave, Daphne, Miriam, and Tarun, of course, and Jenny. Of course, we wouldn't even be having this discussion without the extraordinary role that you've played in all of this. I just want to end by repeating what's been said about putting our research to work. We really need to make this research impactful on the ground and at every level of decision making. That's really what will count in the end, because the challenges are great. And as we have been hearing, progress is nowhere near what it needs to be. So we have our work cut out for us no matter what we do, not just with the people immediately participating, but all of us in our vast audience today as well. And just to remind that the health of nations has so much to do with the well-being of women and girls. This is critical. It's not just about women and girls, as important as that is, but it is about all of society. So let's bear that in mind and not marginalize these issues, but bring them to the center of decision making. So thank you all, to each and every one of you. Please look at the website for detailed information dealing with every aspect of the data that's presented in the index, as well as the country rankings. Thank you, and for all you're doing, for all you will continue to do. And we're very grateful to each of you.